for questions in anticipation of this episode, which is how early should one do an eye exam on their child? And how regularly should we all be doing eye exams? Also, is the fact that I think I can see normally confirmation that I can see as well as I think I can? So that's really 3 questions. But baby comes out, do they check their eyes right away? And if so, how? And how often should they check? And what kind of information is there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's obviously something that touches us all. So the answer to that really differs a little bit at the different stages of life. First of all, every baby gets an eye exam or should be getting an eye exam. And one of the main things that you really just are screening for right when that baby is born, right in the nursery, right in those first few days, is to just look for a red reflex. You know, when you take a camera picture, a flash picture, and sometimes you get red eye, that's actually the light from the flash is, reflecting against the retina and coming back out of your eye. It looks red. And a red reflex is actually very normal. That's great. And if you have one of a number of diseases in the eye that can present even in babies, even in newborn babies, including most concerning but thankfully least common retinoblastoma, which is the most common pediatric eye cancer, which again, thankfully is quite rare. Those babies won't have a red reflex in that eye. It'll be kind of a whitish or gray reflex. And so even just that first little, doctors taking the little pen light and even just flashing it in the baby's eyes. So that's our first eye exam. And hopefully we've all had that. And hopefully every baby being born today is getting that first eye exam, is really just looking for that red reflex. It's not typical, as long as that's looking good, to worry about getting an eye exam from there kind of through childhood, like maybe early elementary school, unless your baby is presenting with one of a number of features that parents often pick up on. For example, as the baby's aging through those first couple of years, through the first couple of years, babies actually don't have great visual acuity. And so as they're aging over those first couple of years, it's normal for them to have, roving eye movements, for example, be searching their environment. But over those first couple of years, if parents start noticing the baby isn't making eye contact or looking where a sound is. Certainly if they have what's called nystagmus, like these rapid flickering, alternating eye movements, anything like that, of course, you're going to trigger an eye exam. But otherwise, most babies, other than their pediatrician doing that red reflex check when they're in for their regular well-child checks, that's really all that's needed through that. When most kids get to elementary school age, there will often done at the schools an amblyopia screening exam. If kids' eyes, either if one eye doesn't see that well, like maybe you're very nearsighted or farsighted in one eye and pretty normal-sighted in the other, or the two refractive errors are quite different from each other, that can lead to a condition you've talked about on the podcast before called amblyopia, which is probably one of the more common or most common eye diseases of children. Or if the eyes aren't aligned, our eye muscles and the brain behind them are really responsible for keeping the two eyes looking straight ahead. And if that's not working properly and one eye is off kilter, and therefore the image of what we're looking at is falling on different spots of the retina, it's not syncing up right in the brain, that can lead to this disease condition called amblyopia, where that eye is no longer talking to the brain properly. And there's a pretty easy screening exam that can be done for strabismus, the misalignment of the eyes that kids will do in elementary school. The other main presenting symptom of kids in elementary school is when they admit to their parents, I can't see the board, or I can't see the teacher up front. And then they might be quite nearsighted. And so that will also trigger an exam. And so those are usually the parts for babies, for toddlers, for children, school-age children, that might reasonably trigger an exam.
A couple of questions about early eye exams, and we'll get on to eye exams in older individuals in a second. But I want to interrupt you with this question. So you mentioned that there can be a misalignment of the eyes. I've seen many people's babies where there is one eyeball that seems to be kind of drifting around, and then it might correct, but sometimes they'll have we don't want to get technical here, but for our listeners, we'll keep it general, but either convergent eyes or one eye converging, cross eyes, or wall-eyed, again, using that non-technical language here. And my understanding is that the brain is taking that information in and is very plastic. It's changing at these early stages of development, and that it's fairly critical to get that stuff corrected early on, because if you wait too long, the brain can essentially become blind to the brain cannot learn to handle the proper alignment. So in other words, if a kid has crossed eyes, and they're not corrected until their 20s, it's possible that they will never recover normal vision. Whereas if you align the eyes properly early in development, they can indeed recover vision. How early can and should one consider getting those eye realignments done?
Yeah. Pretty much right on. What they'll do is if they detect any eye misalignment, and sometimes parents are good at noticing that, and sometimes you take a picture and one eye got the red eye reflex and the other one didn't. And sometimes people notice that their kids' eyes are sort of turning in. It seems like too much. Sometimes there's what's called pseudostrabismus, which is where actually, depending on your anatomy, if you have a little extra skin sort of on the inside corners of your eyes, it makes your eyes look turned in when actually they're straight. But if your eyes are actually turned in, or slightly less common in children, more common in adults, misalignment turned out, it's really important to correct that early. And the reason is, as you were saying, the brain starts ignoring it. It fails to fully develop the strong connections for the data coming in from one of those two eyes into the brain. And if you pass certain sort of thresholds during development, during childhood, without correcting that connectivity, getting those two eyes to work together properly, you can permanently lose that. And so we used to use very sort of, gross numbers, like it's fully correctable if you can intervene before age 3. It's partly correctable if you can intervene before age 6. You got a chance before age 9. But it turns out in follow-on studies that even kids into their young teens have a shot at correcting that eye-brain connection, that amblyopia, that loss of vision that can occur during early development. So even if you're only, unfortunately detecting that later on in childhood, or even sort of the tween years or early teen years, it's still worth a try to really push to retrain the weaker eye and then also realign the muscles so that they can work together to keep the eyes focused. I'll tell you, it's interesting, and there's a lot more to learn about brain plasticity, and probably a lot of really cool new therapies yet to discover that could reopen what's called critical period plasticity, this plasticity that we have during development that kind of goes away as we age. And that critical period plasticity, as you know, has been the best studied actually in the visual system. And the idea that we could reopen that is really fantastic. But for different parts of that eye-brain connection, there's different periods for critical period plasticity. For example, even if you get the amblyopic eye to see well again, and then you realign the eyes and now they're working together, a lot of kids will never recover full depth perception, stereopsis, the use of two eyes to see depth, for example. So why that part of the brain doesn't correct as well as the visual acuity or central vision part of the brain, I'm not sure if we understand that yet.
I'm going to ask for a curbside consult, as it's sometimes called right now, by telling you a story. When I was a kid, I went swimming without goggles, and I had one eye closed and the other eye open and closing as it went in and out of the water, because I'm a deficient swimmer and I only breathe to one side unless I really consciously force myself to breathe to both sides in a freestyle swim. Got out of the pool and I was seeing double. It was pretty eerie. And then it became downright scary because I didn't recover my double vision until they patched one of the eyes, forcing me to use the other eye that had been closed the entire time. And fortunately, this was done early enough, and I was young enough that within, I think it was about a day or so, I restored normal vision. However, my depth perception is terrible. I'm the kid that, fly ball was hit to me in the outfield, and it's coming, and then it hit me. This is why I've generally focused on foot sports throughout my entire life, as opposed to, precise hand-eye coordination. I'm better at throwing darts and things with one eye closed than I ever would be with both eyes. Maybe that's true for most people. question I have is it true that even just a few hours of misalignment of information to the two eyes early in development can permanently rewire the brain unless there are some corrective measures, such as patching up one eye? And the example I gave is just one, but for instance, if someone injures, gets a scratch on their cornea and they patch the eye and the person happens to be 10 years old, is it important to then patch the other healthy eye after the scratched eye is feeling better? In other words, how critical is it to ensure the balance of information coming into the two eyes, even on the order of hours or days?
Yeah. Your story it has some features of, totally usual, how we think about misaligned eyes leading to amblyopia, where one eye is weaker, patching the strong eye so the weak eye can recover, but not necessarily fully regaining depth perception. Mm-hmm. And so that part of it is, quite stereotypical. The part of your story that's atypical is that for most kids, an hour or two, let alone minutes, an hour or two, even an hour or two a day, if you were a young kid and you just really were training up on throwing darts and you were just keeping one eye closed to throw the darts, really practicing for an hour a day, it'd be very unusual for that to trigger this kind of either strabismus, misalignment of the eyes, let alone amblyopia. And the strabismus is what's giving you the double vision because they're misaligned, let alone the amblyopia of one eye turning out weaker. If I had to guess, of course, not having, done your exam before that fateful day in the swimming pool, if I had to guess, I would guess that you may have had some intermittent strabismus and your brain was already getting kind of hit. And neither you nor your parents may have even noticed it. It could be happening, at other times a day, or you're not kind of really paying attention. It doesn't kind of stand out in the way that day that you got out of the swimming pool, you really noticed it. And it may not have been that strong. It may have been quite intermittent. But if you had some years of intermittent esotropia, or turning in of the eyes, or exotropia, turning out of the eyes, that just happened here and there, but was accumulating sort of damage or failure to connect over years leading up to that day in the swimming pool, and that day just tipped you over the edge and you've got double vision, you really noticed it. That led to an eye exam at an eye care provider, and they said, wait a second, this eye's stronger, this eye's weaker. You've got a little amblyopia. We're going to start patching your strong eye so you can get your weak eye back. So for 99.9% of the kids who they get a little corneal scratch, or they're patching one eye closed, or anything that's sort of a rare event like that, nothing to worry about. Parents don't have to worry. Kids can be kids. They can play. They can do that kind of thing, and not have to worry. And it's unfortunate that we can't tell in advance which kid's been having the intermittent amblyopia, because we don't do a standard eye exam on every 5-year-old who's not complaining of anything. But yeah, so that's an unusual case in yours. And if I had to guess, I would bet that you were having some sort of subclinical, untracked, uncharted, unnoticed, maybe strabismus leading up to that point.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. You can send me a bill at the end. Along those lines, I'm 47 years old, so I was part of the generation that grew up with some computers in the classroom, but not a lot. Nowadays, kids from a very young age are looking at iPads and phones and screens and things very close up. And there is a wealth of experimental animal data showing that if you limit vision to just close range, that the eyeball lengthens, and therefore the visual image falls in front of and not directly onto the neural retina, essentially the light sensing portion of the eye. And those animals become myopic or nearsighted. What can we say about the environmental conditions in which kids are seeing from the time they're born through, let's say, adolescence and their teen years, in terms of how their visual system wires up? And are there any recommendations that are coming from the scientific literature, clinical trials, or otherwise, that indicate what a healthy visual environment consists of?
Yeah. That's a great question. And actually, it's really relevant these days because, myopia is so common. It's more common in Asian populations. It's called an epidemic in China. In California, we have a lot of Asian heritage or Asian Americans. And so we see a lot, like at Stanford, we see a lot of, myopia in kids and adults, and really starting to get thoughtful on the science of myopia control. How do we provide the right environments? Now, what's interesting is that for decades, the assumption, some of the data really led us to the path of thinking like, gosh, the more you spend at near activities, and these are mouse model experiments like you described, but also well-designed human cohort studies, figuring out like asking, kids and families, like how long is your kid reading or in front of the computer? How myopic are they? How nearsighted are they? Versus how much time is your kid in front of the computer doing near work? How myopic or nearsighted are they? And these well-designed cohort studies did point towards this concept that if you do too much near work as a kid, that you're more likely to develop nearsightedness as you get through those sort of preteen and even into the teen years, which is when most of that myopia progression or eyeball elongation is actually happening to cause nearsightedness. It's only been in the last few years that some really exciting studies have actually pointed in a slightly different direction. And that's that maybe it's not to say it's not about near activity, but maybe it's not all about near activity. Maybe it's actually a little more about the kind of light we're getting into our eyes. And I think you've talked about this before, and it's really important. When they've now studied and asked the kids, instead of just how much near and how much far are you doing, how much time are you spending indoors in indoor lighting, which doesn't have full spectrum light in a typical indoor environment, versus how much time are you spending outdoors, playing in the yard? You could be reading outside, but what kind of time are you spending outside? And of course, when you're outside in sunlight, even if it's in direct sunlight, you're getting a different spectrum of kind of full spectrum lighting from the sun. And it looks like it's pretty clear now, actually, that it has maybe more to do with outdoor lighting time than just near work. And so I think that, we've actually already seen the first couple randomized controlled trials where they're having kids intentionally spending time outdoors versus sort of standard life, which, is going to be often much more indoor time. And seeing some effects. You follow those kids over a couple of years, and the kids who spend time outdoors are progressing in their nearsightedness less. Like their nearsighted prescription is not getting as strong as the kids who are spending more time indoors. And there's some pretty good biology that's getting worked out, going back to animal models, more about how that might be working in the retina inside the eye. But it's pretty compelling concept. And so, as a parent, you may want to be telling your kid, like, okay, yeah, I want you to read that book, or, if your kid's playing on the phone or something like that, or the iPad or something like that, they're allowed that time. Okay, you can have that time, but I want you to spend some of the time that you're doing that outdoors.
Are there any thresholds for the amount of time that one would suggest their child be outdoors to get that full spectrum light?
It's a great question. We talk about cohort studies where we just ask people, what are they doing? And there seems to be, a little bit of what we would call a dose-dependent response. Maybe the more time outdoors might be better. We don't know if there's an upper limit, like, gosh, if you go over 2 or 3 hours, there's no additional benefit. We talk about that in cohort studies. The real gold standard for answering these kinds of questions are randomized controlled trials, and specifically placebo-controlled or a control group that's not getting the intervention. That's our highest level of evidence for clinical evidence for any of this kind of science when we're talking about humans or preclinical models in the laboratory. And the study that hasn't been done yet to really answer that question is to randomize kids to telling this group of kids, you just do your normal life. Tell this group of kids, we want you outside an hour. This group of kids, we want you outside 2 hours a day. This group of kids, 3 hours a day. And see between the groups, is there a big difference? Like, we have pretty good evidence now from the studies that have been done that the difference between 0 and 1 or 2 hours is clearly there. Is 5 minutes enough? Is 5 hours better? I don't think we know the answers to those questions yet, like what's the right dose, but there's probably at least some dose dependence to that.
And I can imagine it's a little bit hard to tease apart the near-far viewing from the indoor-outdoor because, yes, of course, a child could be outside on an iPad up close, but it's hard to imagine that at some point they aren't seeing off into the distance, far viewing, as it's called. And the reverse is also true. If you're indoors, unless you live in a very, very large home or you're staring off a balcony, far viewing is much harder to achieve.
Yeah.
So it's, and perhaps it isn't important to isolate these variables, although I can see the challenge in developing a really good clinical trial, randomized clinical trial for this. Meanwhile, I'll go into the grave shouting, or saying rather, and suggesting that people get some morning sunlight in their eyes to set their circadian rhythm. But far viewing at least a few minutes and ideally hours per day, or a mixture of near and far viewing by being outdoors just seems like a good thing to do regardless of age. So are there any data in older people, not necessarily elderly, but older people? So people in their, from say 25 years of age into their 60s or 70s, that getting outdoors and getting this full spectrum light is healthy for the eye in ways that are separate from the known healthy effects of doing that on circadian rhythm setting.
Yeah. The circadian part's pretty clear. In most people, the development of nearsightedness happens a lot until age 10, little more through age 20, little more than that in through the 20s up to 30. Tiny bit in the 30s up to 40, but usually by those later ages, your prescription might be changing a quarter of a diopter. That's the measurement that we use when we, give you your glasses prescription. A quarter of a diopter, half a diopter. It could get a half diopter more nearsighted or less nearsighted, once you're aging into your 40s, 50s, and beyond. So most of the action on nearsightedness development is actually really happening in the younger ages. So again, the premise of intervening in an older person, and I'll just include you and me and older people for the sake of this definition, as much as I'm reticent to do that in general. I think the premise of sort of light modulation for nearsightedness in older people is probably not so strong. I think there are a lot of other benefits. You've talked a lot about circadian rhythm. There are so many health benefits to exercise. And, if you're getting outdoors, there's a good chance you're going to be walking or bicycling, So exercise value for the health of our eyes and the rest of our body is clearly there. But I don't know that there's really a strong premise that you're going to change your glasses prescription, in our 40s or 50s or